Hello everyone, welcome to Teacher Development webinars. My name is Zamanullah Sand. I facilitate virtual programs at Teacher Development webinars. Teacher Development webinars is a social action project to support teachers and educators around the world with professional development opportunities. It is an initiative using the rise in online professional development to connect people from around the world with opportunities which they may not have had due to old normal of face-to-face conferences. And in this webinar, getting a real extensive reading into curriculum will demonstrate models of ER that can be included in adult English language programs along with materials to assist in developing an extensive reading program. We'll present the rationale and the basic practices of including extensive reading in a reading curriculum. Now, it's my pleasure and privilege to introduce Dr. Doreen Ewert for this webinar. Dr. Doreen Ewert, PhD, is a professor in the Department of Rhetoric and Languages and director of the Academic English for a Multilingual Student Program at the University of San Francisco. Teaching and research on several aspects of second language learning and teaching for pre-academic and matriculated adult language learners, language teacher development, curriculum implementation, second language literacy development, content-based instruction, extensive reading, integrated task assessment, and vocabulary development. She has directed language programs and taught undergraduate and graduate applied linguistic courses at 3 universities in the US and 1 university in Lithuania. And she regularly presents papers and facilitates workshops for language instructors on various aspects of instructed language teaching nationally and internationally. She has published in a variety of teacher-friendly journals such as TESOL Journal, TESOL Journal, Journal of Second Language Writing, Language Testing, and Journal of Basic Writing. She has served on TESOL International Professional Development Council as a commissioner for the Commission on English Program Accreditation, which accredits language programs around the world. Thank you so very much, Dr. Ewert. It's an honor to have you at Teacher Development webinar.
Thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this forum. It's quite exciting to see where everybody is coming from around the world. I'm really just delighted to be participating in this event. Now, I want to make sure that we are actually sharing the right screen here. So let me just make sure that we're all together here. Hopefully you can see the screen now, and I will start. There will be a few times when I'm going to ask people to maybe answer some questions in the chat box. That will help me to know who you are, but also to just share some information about your context of learning. So I'll let you know when it's time for that. And then we'll have time for questions at the end. So every time you see a slide like this, I would like you to...
Dr. Doreen, sorry to interrupt, but it's not the right screen. Yep.
Well, I'm sorry about that. Let me try it again. That was the screen that we tested. Okay.
So there are two. Yep. So.
Right, but it should be this one. Let's see, how about that? Is that the right screen?
Yep, that's perfect.
Okay, great. So if you would just for a moment, just so I get a sense for who's in this meeting, if you could put into the chat, okay, if you could put into the chat, who do you teach and what are your learners, why are your learners learning English? What are their purposes for learning English? If you could just take a minute and put some things in the chat box. I'd really like to see. Great, so a lot of, okay, so the whole range, it looks like, right? The whole range of students, but mostly it looks like university and high school, right? So they just, general communication, or maybe for going on to school, enter university. All right, so these are, you know, the common goals. And what's interesting about extensive reading is that it can be of value to all learners, really for all purposes, particularly there's recent research that if you find the right text, absolute beginners can begin to do extensive reading. So the real question is why, right? Why should we do this? And I'll just spend a few minutes talking about why before talking about how. So one of the main reasons that we need to do something like extensive reading is the fact that we simply cannot possibly give our students enough English by the best efforts that we make explicitly in the classroom. And, you know, we all spend a lot of time trying to maximize what we do in the classroom to make it as effective as possible. And that's great. And I'm not saying we shouldn't do it. But the reality is that we've learned that, in fact, just like in your primary languages, with second language learning as well, most of what we learn that we can use, you might say spontaneously whenever, is actually learned implicitly when we're not paying attention. So the explicit knowledge, what we can actually teach in the classroom, practice, talk about in the classroom, is, you might say, only the tip of the iceberg of what someone needs to learn. And so, yes, classroom instruction is good, but how are we actually going to let the students in on, lead them, provide them the opportunities for that mass of language, you know, beneath the surface or not explicit, that they actually need to acquire? And so extensive reading is actually one of the ways, it's not the only way, but it is one of the ways, and some would say perhaps the most effective way, of trying to use a small amount, not even a lot, of our classroom time to lead students into a practice which actually will help them to access the volume, the massive amounts of language that they actually need to encounter, not explicitly, but implicitly, for the language learning that they really want. So what is required when we talk about implicit learning? Well, first of all, they're not really paying attention to learning. They're really just thinking about the meaning. They're actually getting messages. They are communicating. It is purposeful, meaningful, and they don't think that they're learning. The second thing is that it has to be huge amounts, and research on the amount of language that actually is found in textbooks or that can possibly be introduced in the short amount of time we have with students in the classroom is just a drop in the bucket of what students actually need to build up, you might say, the procedural knowledge and the complexity of a language, which simply can't be taught. In fact, there is some research that suggests trying to teach parts of the language explicitly can sometimes actually be detrimental for the learner. And then the third thing is that they just have to have, again, they have to spend time for different purposes producing and comprehending language. So it needs to be familiar in the sense that if it's familiar enough, I don't mean that they already know it, but the language is familiar enough that they're not really thinking that they're learning. There needs to be a huge amount of it, and then they're using it for meaningful purposes. Well, in really a typical classroom, and this comes from Bamford and Day, in a typical classroom, and it's possible to continue with some, but most of the time, all we get is intensive reading. So we read for accuracy. Sometimes it's translation. Sometimes it's, can you, understand the grammar? A lot of times it's just, questions about the content, which sometimes means, memory more than comprehension. Often the focus is actually on words, pronunciation, or grammar. And very often the teacher chooses it. It's a little bit difficult. And so we provide support and scaffolding to help the students engage. This actually reduces the amount, right? It's not familiar. It pushes them right at their edge. Students read quite slowly, and often they have to use a dictionary. Now, those things can be done in the classroom and some should be done, but it really can't account for the whole package. There's something else is needed. And so if you look at the slide here, you can see extensive reading provides something very, very different. And I would say that in spite of, in addition to spending some time in the classroom, one of the great benefits of extensive reading is that after a period of training, and the role of the instructor is very important, but after a certain amount of time, much of extensive reading can actually happen outside the classroom. And I don't know if you all attended, but recently there was a webinar with TD Webinars by Dr. Tom Robb, and he spent a lot of time talking about materials, accessible, free, available, online, paper, materials that you can use. I'm going to spend a little less time on materials, but kind of talk about how can you fit this into a curriculum when already we often feel like, oh, there's not enough time, to do everything that is expected of us. Well, one of the ways to do that is to really consider what Paul Nation says is a balanced curriculum. He contains that, promotes this notion that every curriculum needs to be a balance between meaning-focused input, meaning-focused output, form-focused learning, and fluency development. Now, what's interesting when we think about that, we might say, well, of course, all those things I do in my classroom, we focus on meaning, I give them input, we get a text, they read it, and then, they have to do something meaningful. But if we look at what he actually means by these categories, we might find something quite different. In fact, what he tells us is that meaning-focused input is actually when we're really thinking about meaning, we're not consciously thinking about learning. We're really, really focused on the message. And that would suggest that a lot of time that we spend in the classroom in this analysis might not be considered meaning-focused input. And notice, as an example activity, Nation and Waring, in their relatively new book on extensive reading, published in 2020, they actually give extensive reading and extensive listening as good examples of meaning-focused input and conversation, right? Not dialogues that they prepare and perform, but free conversation among students. Meaning-focused output is similar activity, but of course it's in the output mode. Now you don't see extensive reading here, but when we consider some of the activities that we can engage in that support extensive reading, they can be seen as meaning-focused output. Notice again the importance in both of these categories of the concept of incidental language learning. The focus is not on the language, the focus is on meaning, message making, which means the language has to be within, you might say, the linguistic competence of the students and where they actually can function in the language. Then we have the third category, which is language-focused learning. And I would contend that in many, many classrooms, and I believe that to be true around the world, but what I have observed, but also here in an English dominant environment, a great deal of the curriculum is taken up with what happens in the textbook. And in addition to that, grammar practice, intentional vocabulary work, text analysis. And I'm talking here specifically about a reading curriculum, not the whole curriculum. But the principle of a balanced curriculum applies no matter what your course is, right? If it's integrated skills or content-based instruction or reading or writing, think about it as balanced among these four categories. And then finally, the last category is fluency development itself. And I would also say, from my experience in observing classrooms over several decades, that this is also an area that very little direct attention has been paid to. Certainly, it's not very common in textbooks to find actual attention to fluency development. Often we think fluency is what you get at the end of all this language study. But here we're talking about fluency as something that is easy and smooth and relatively quick, which is one element of proficiency in language development, right? So there's complexity, there's accuracy, and there's fluency. So fluency development here, you notice there is extensive reading here again, but this also refers to other activities that just help learners with the language that they have at the moment to be able to produce it more quickly with more comfort. And these are often 5 to 10 minute types of, you might say, time constrained pressure activities to build fluency, although extensive reading does not have the same time constraint. So if we think about that, and there again is the extensive reading. So now consider where extensive reading goes. So if this is a balanced curriculum, about 25% of your time in these 4 categories, well, excuse me, ER is a major component for meaning. ER is a major component for fluency development. ER is a smaller but relevant activity to, you might say, talk about, which becomes a part of meaning-focused output. The only area you don't find ER is in what has traditionally been the classroom activity, which is form-focused or language. I don't mean it here in the grammatical sense, but just language-focused learning. If we think about now implicit learning in comparison, familiarity and focus of the meaning is exactly what's happening with meaning-focused input and meaning-focused output. And then priming the massive amounts of language are also through fluency development, as in the other 2. So if you were just to stop and think about your reading curriculum right now, how would you characterize your curriculum by percentage related to this model? How much of your time is spent on meaning-focused input, output, and fluency development compared to language-focused learning? And you might want to just put something into the chat. Okay, I see a couple of responses there. And the truth is, until I started doing extensive reading, I would have had to say that, I thought I was doing a lot of meaningful stuff, but honestly, it still was very orchestrated around the textbook. And in fact, this is what sent me to the research and to investigate how can I help my learners to become faster, more efficient readers of the language, because how else are they going to get enough language into their brains? I sometimes tell my students when they leave the classroom, what are you going to do tonight to get more English into your brain? Right? And how better to get it than by doing something that is actually not always immediately, but within time, quite pleasurable. Right. Okay. All right. Good to know. All right. So then let's talk about ER. So, oops, I got ahead of myself. So here's a definition of ER. You can find different ones, and this is one that I've put together that tries to identify some of the criterial factors or characteristics. That it's silent. This is not reading out loud. It's not reading together. This is, you might say, this is authentic reading behavior, the kind of reading behavior that you find that you can do easily in your own language, right? So it's silent, it's independent, it's large amounts. Well, okay, that we can argue about how much our students are doing in their own languages, but we also know that when we read, except for our language-focused word, we select what we read, right? And we're only interested in comprehension. In fact, if we pick up a book and we don't like it, we put it down and get a different one. So we're really trying to, in a sense, provide students the opportunity to experience authentic reading lives in the target language. Well, how can you do that? I mean, after all, when we talk about an authentic text, well, if we mean a text that was written for a native speaker, by a native speaker, well, that's of course going to be impossible for beginning learners. But the truth is, we can read any text within our linguistic capacity. We can read authentically. We can read like real readers, and part of that is silent, independent, and a lot, and making choices about what we read. Of course, these are pictures of paper graded readers. Graded readers, again, are only graded if they are totally organized around a particular vocabulary list. There are lots of them in English, and of course, now there are many materials online. Some of them are inexpensive, and some of them are free. Oops, I'm on the wrong screen for that. Okay. Now, nothing can make a teacher happier, however, than when they start to see the results of ER and what their students say about it. You can read that yourself. And of course, I have not edited these. These are the actual words that students wrote in their journals about. So again, this is meaningful output because they're actually talking about or writing about their reading experiences. So what are the obstacles? Why isn't everybody doing this? In fact, I've been at conferences where Dr. Bill Grabe, one of our leading reading researchers in second language learning, it's like the evidence is so clear, the benefits are so obvious. Why isn't everybody doing this? And there are all kinds of ideas, you know, that people have that keep them from it. And one is this idea that if we just give students books to read, what are we doing? The parents, the administrators, others are just going to think we're being lazy. Well, I will tell you, there is a very active role for the instructor in extensive reading, and I'll look at that in a moment. I just mentioned this idea that, well, we can't read texts that are somehow modified to make them more accessible for readers because that wouldn't be authentic. And Day and Bamford respond to that with, yeah, well, how about reading authentically? Analyzing and focusing on grammar and vocabulary in 500 words of text is not like an authentic person reading something. And then, of course, you know, we get textbooks and we get a curriculum. Sometimes it's handed to us, and there are expectations that we follow it and we cover it, whatever that means, right? And I say that because I don't even know what it means to cover a curriculum. Because if it means it just went past my lips, it doesn't really mean necessarily that the students learned anything. Of course, students are resistant because they're almost always only asked to read things that are, you might say, at the edge or even beyond their comprehension. And then they get to do very inauthentic things with that text that doesn't feel like reading at all. So yeah, they're resistant. I was resistant to reading in my foreign languages until I had to take an exam, and not that long ago. And then I realized, oh, well, I guess I better do extensive reading myself now that I, you know, tell other people about it. And sure enough, it was a little hard at first, but you know, well, I'll just say I did fine on the exam, and I didn't go back and study any grammar. And then teachers sometimes have trouble trusting the students. Like, do we need to test? Do I have to have a book report for every book read? There's nothing wrong with some of those activities, but if they sort of take over from the reading, then we've missed the point of getting massive amounts of language into the brains of our students. So, and then of course, sometimes teachers just aren't aware of how much research there is already available that tell us how efficacious, how necessary extensive reading is. And I would say, especially when teaching even high school, but definitely with adult learners, I think it's important for them to actually, I don't mean read the research, but we can certainly tell our students and even point out to them, you know, I'm not being lazy here, people. There's a lot of research why we're doing this. So what do you think are the obstacles for you, particularly? maybe all of you are already doing extensive reading, but think of your colleagues then. What kinds of obstacles do you see in your environment that keep you and others from implementing extensive reading? Just make a comment in the chat. And I'll try to answer questions when we get just through the slides here. So any thoughts about that? What's keeping you or your colleagues from implementing this? Well, that and lack of time, right? And the prescribed text. I mean, these are realities we live with. But again, if we start to think about what makes a balanced curriculum, how can we shave off, 5 minutes of this and 10 minutes of that? And I'll show you some models of how you can make this a part of the class. And again, within a very short time, much of this can be happening independently outside of class with mechanisms for you to manage the activity, you might say, keep track of the activity in class, which students also then see the value of it. If you value it, they will value it. Finances are a problem, but again, please look at Dr. Tom Robb's webinar because he talks about a lot of options that are available already in English for free materials online provided by people involved in the Extensive Reading Foundation, but otherwise as well. And the students misunderstand, and that is one of the jobs, right, of the instructor. And I will get to that in just a second then. So that was sort of just a short, introduction on why, but let's look at the how. Well, I would say that to get ER into the curriculum, you need to pay attention to these categories here, okay? And some of them are probably more important than others, but we'll just take a quick look. I will not read every slide. We will not talk about every point because I want to get to the place where we have questions, but you will be able to see examples and also actual materials that you can use for some of these important components. So teacher's role, orientation is extremely important. You have to orientate yourself. You need to really, you might say, you have to believe in it, right? And I don't mean, without evidence. You need to read the evidence that's available. If you go to the erfoundation.org website, you can find actual guides in many languages on sort of what is ER, the rationale for it. Look at the literature and read some of the literature that is being written now directly for language learners at all ages, younger and older, literature that is being written authentically for them. And it's authentic because it was written for them. You really have to orient your students. And so engage them in all kinds of reflective activities, which again can be meaningful output opportunities, help them to understand the difference between implicit and explicit learning, help them look at the literature, and then you've got to spend time with training. Now the training has to happen really in the classroom. Oh, of course, you can orient other stakeholders like, administrators, your supervisor, other teachers. So basically, we've got to get people a bit on the same page to make it successful. But sometimes you can start small in your classroom, and then you can see by people's sort of like, what are your students doing? And why are they coming to class early? And why are they staying late because they want to finish a book? Honestly, that has been my experience. Students coming to class early so that they can, start reading the books that I bring, or telling me to wait a little longer because they're almost done. Nothing can make me happier than to see my students wanting to read. Modeling and guiding. So once you introduce either online or in some paper materials and have students reading some things in the class, observe them. You can tell right away whether they're faking it. You can tell whether they're jumping around and it's really maybe too difficult for them. So observing students for a while, giving them advice on materials and the practices, like, you should spend this much time, be sure you're in a quiet place, that kind of thing. Sometimes students don't realize that, oh, like you should actually like maybe have a cup of coffee with you when you're reading. It's quite a nice thing. So they see it as such a school task that they haven't thought about how they could actually integrate this into a very comfortable lifestyle and actually read literature with the students. So this is sometimes where the teacher, feels like, oh, now I'm sitting in class, the students are reading and I'm reading. If someone looks in the room, they're going to think we're just fooling around. It's like, no, you're not at all. You're actively engaged in modeling and guiding the students. And then, of course, you promote literacy in general. And so by that, I mean, you have occasional book chats, and it's like having a book club in your class where students talk about their stories with each other and with the class and make recommendations, and maybe occasionally a book review or a poster or something about one of the books. And there are many different things that you can do. Again, this is meaningful output, but it's completely related to extensive reading. Now, I have found that on Zoom, which I've been teaching remotely now for more than a year, I have been able to use all of these mechanisms to engage students in doing these activities. So particularly for the club kind of activities, talking about their books in rooms and making Spark pages and things like that. And these things are free and online. So here are some examples, and we're not going to have time to look here because you can get these all from the PowerPoint yourself and use them. But these are examples of things that I might use to engage students after some period of reading. Remember, we're not reading the same book. They're all reading different books. And the lovely thing is this is one of the best activities that you can actually address the proficiency differences among your students. Yeah, maybe they all took a test and they're all in a certain class because of it. But the truth is that is like an aggregation of a range of abilities and skills. So when you actually look at that group and have them read, they're going to be reading at all different levels. And ER is precisely situated for them to work within their linguistic competence. Whereas the textbook, whether you're ahead or behind, you're all just have to work at the same place. So then we will look now at, that didn't seem like the right slide. Oh, yes, placement. So the teacher's role. Now we talk about placement. So how do we help students to figure out, what they should read? So you've got a number of materials, and again, it doesn't really matter what the publishers say it is, because in fact, all the publishers use different scales. But of course, we have to try to at least introduce them initially to a set of materials that will be remotely close to them. Nonetheless, we need to figure out, and they need to figure out on their own, how can I tell whether a book is good for me? And so there are materials that are free and available, like these tests, like number one, you can actually email me and I can send them to you. The 5-finger rule is almost the best. Anybody can do it. You open up sort of in the middle of a book and you say, every time I meet a word that I really don't know what it means, I put up a finger. And once I have 5 fingers up, that book is too hard. I got to find something else. Put it away, look for something that would be easier than that. And there are other things that you can do. These are all things that are possible. But I can tell you for sure, you cannot overestimate how easy the text needs to be. So if you imagine my students that I am doing ER with here at my university in San Francisco, these are students who are already admitted to university. So on an IBT, the internet-based TOEFL, these students have a minimum of 65 IBT. So they haven't met the minimum requirement for no additional help, which is 80. So they're somewhere in between 65 and 80. And these students, in fact, I've done it with students who all have 80 or more. And these students are reading. It's unbelievable how easy the book needs to be for them to read it quickly, smoothly, and enjoyably without using a dictionary and struggling. So just think really low. And, you know, what can you say? Well, if it's too low, you'll be able to read 10 of those very quickly. And then you can move on to something a little bit harder. So it's not, in fact, it doesn't matter that it's easy. That's actually fine. It's the repetition of language, of structures, of vocabulary in meaningful context that is actually causing the implicit learning. So lots of easy, no problem. Okay. Again, I'm not going to spend time on this right now, but here are some of those different options. So it actually, you know, gives you examples of what you can do with students to help them, or to help you help them find their placement in, you might say, the different levels of reading, so that they can find something to read easily. And you can look back at that. You'll have access to it in the YouTube. So then record keeping. Record keeping actually turns out to be a very important factor, because it values what the students are doing, but more importantly, it actually becomes its own self-motivating, you might say, evidence for the students. And there's different ways of keeping records. You can keep lists of the names of the books, you can keep the level of the books, but in terms of language learning, ultimately it's the number of words that they've read. So there are different ways that you can do it, how much time it takes for them. Sometimes write a brief review. Recently, Dr. Rob shared with me, just I think yesterday, that an instructor in Malaysia, oh no, excuse me, in Indonesia was using this with students. And when you use one of the free online sources for short story quizzes, they're incredibly short little quizzes, and they're not like looking for, you know, crazy facts. They're just there to kind of, you know, if you can answer the question, you've obviously at least read something in the book. But when you read it and are successful, you get to take the picture of that book and put it on your page. And this was like for junior high kids. It had become such a motivating factor that more and more kids were joining the English club, so to speak, because they love to have this, you know, page that had all these pictures of the titles of the books they had read. So there's something about keeping track that is really motivating to students. Now, I do something on a Google Doc. You know, it can be on paper. I used to do it on paper. Now I can do it on a Google Doc. I create a doc for each student so I can see it. And they put in the date, the title, the time it took them to read, the level, and that's just a level according to my system. They tell me how many words. Most of the books give a total number of words on the book, or it's easy. I teach them how to estimate that. They give me a really one-word quality, you know, easy, okay, hard, you know, weird. And then they write one sentence. And I don't want them to spend a lot of time writing, because I really want them to read. And I actually keep track of this. And I sometimes then also put it into an Excel chart or file and make it into a figure, and I show the class, and they don't know. Well, they know who they are on the list, but I don't tell the students who's number one and who's number two. But it's kind of like, well, let's see who's doing a lot of reading. These are actual numbers of words, for example, in that first file that my students, and what I do is after training, so in the first couple of weeks of a full university semester, I'll spend, you know, maybe a half an hour a few times, and then it's all out of classwork. And I require them to do 2 hours every week. And I find that within one semester, students typically read close to 200,000 words. And then you get some people who are way up over that amount. And so you can see here, in a semester, I required about 25 hours of reading, and most of them made it. And I show them along the way too, so that they are motivated. Grading, And that this is another part that teachers struggle with, like, how do I do this as part of my curriculum? Because how do I grade it if I don't test it, if I don't know what they're doing? Well, you know, it can be a component of a total grade. After all, we're still going to do intensive reading activity. And yes, I have found that I work on an honor system. I look at these charts. I figured out ways. Very few people actually, because they're doing it within their linguistic competence, most people end up just being so delighted that they can actually read a whole text from beginning to end. I honestly have had very little difficulty with students, you know, trying to, like, I don't know, put a bunch of names or books in that they didn't read. And there are ways you can check on that too. But for me, I'm fortunate. I'm able to simply give them a sort of a, you know, check you did it, check you didn't do it for that part of the course, not for the whole course. And then I would suggest also, and this is how we can build both motivation for students, but also for all of our, you might say, acceptance for all of our stakeholders. I like to keep track. In fact, I do action research in every ER, you know, component, every course that I do. I collect data on the ER component so that I can and show this kind of thing. So I use the EPR. You can ask me about that later. I can send it to you. I use it as a pre and a post analysis. And these are my pre and post scores. You know, these are, I mean, I do it every semester. These are older semesters in the slide here. But for the most part, students have, and I've collected data over the years, and in previous studies, the development was actually statistically significant in a semester-long course. Now, implicit learning is slower than explicit learning, but here's the upside. It's more durable. Once you have it, you get to keep, it's in there for way longer because it's actually going into a different type of memory than the explicit learning. So these are things that I do for record keeping, grading, and assessment, keeping track of these different things. Again, you can look at these later, you know, what might work for you in a session. But let's just, one more journal aspect here, excerpt, and then I'll show you kind of how I have fitted into my curriculum. And the comments that you see here, you may notice by the pictures, but the comments here are almost all from students in, you might say, the regions of the world that most of you represent here. So here's just kind of a summary. Again, Tom Robb did a full presentation on a lot of these materials, but if you didn't go to that, definitely go to these websites and you will find a tremendous amount of useful information on free and inexpensive materials. And again, here's the book by Tom Robb. Another one, I have a chapter on ER for implicit learning in this new handbook. And then here's the ER Foundation, which is just the #1 stop for everything about extensive reading. Okay, so we can talk about more specifics, but basically, you know, once we know that we can do it, there are many ways to incrementally sort of put this into your class if you value it, and you can see that after a little bit of training, most of this can be out of the classroom. So I'd love to answer questions now, which, you know, are more specific. So if you would put questions into the chat room, I will try to answer them now. And I will stop my screen share. Hang on here a second, so that we can see each other. And I don't know if it's possible, but if you can unmute, if you want to just ask me a question, that's also fine. Someone says there that the core of the problem.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Doreen Ewert.
Yeah. Okay. So we can ask some few. Can we do a little question and answer?
Yep.
Okay. So I notice here
someone, we can. And
Okay, I'm going to comment on one of the written ones here. Someone says the core of the problem is in learning the language, not the reading. But that's what we're saying. The reading is essential for learning the language. You cannot learn the language explicitly and then you start reading, because there's just way too much language to learn to be able to do that. You couldn't spend enough time in the classroom, or very arduous time. So we're talking about efficiency. Early on, you need to be implementing extensive reading to increase the volume, the massive amounts of language, natural language that they are getting, so that they can actually become readers and learn the language. You should look at the research if you're uncertain about this, because there is clear research that students who do even modest amounts of extensive reading over like a course of a semester are seeing gains in grammar. In fact, a recent study by Natsuki Aka in Japan, it showed that she had several big groups, large groups, and one group got they both got the textbook stuff, and then one group got extensive reading and the other group got just more of the textbook. And when they tested them at the end, the ER group had actually gained in grammatical knowledge more than the students who had the in-classroom activities. So there was less attention explicitly to language, and the students gained greater grammatical knowledge because of the extensive reading. You just can't teach it. It's too much. So yes, teach and make sure that they're getting a lot of language in there.
That's great. So I've collected some of the questions, and
Sure.
Bilkis asked that how much reading can be described as extensive reading?
Okay, it's only extensive reading if it is reading that is easy enough for the students to do without a text, without a dictionary. They're doing it silently, independently, and they have some possibility to make choices about what they are reading. So there are other types of reading. Reading, any kind of reading is good, but extensive reading is a very particular sort. It is not guided by the teacher. It is not difficult. It is not followed up with a series of comprehension questions. Okay, so taking a little quiz to see if you've read the book is very different than, our textbooks are filled. I mean, all the reading textbooks are still, here's a text, here's a bunch of questions, here's the pre-questions, here's this, now let's study the vocabulary. Now let's look at some reading strategies. That is not extensive reading. Okay, extensive reading really has to be something that students read, and that they're full texts. They're not little paragraphs. They're not, here's 500 words on, this sport, and here's 200 words on that animal. These are, and it's fiction, it's nonfiction, that doesn't matter, but they are coherent, complete texts within the student's linguistic capacity, and they read it silently and independently. That's what makes it extensive reading. Other questions?
That's great. So Marcia Escobar from Ecuador, she asked, how do we encourage our students to be fond of reading? So that's a very common question we get, how to motivate them.
Oh, absolutely. Well, like I said, I mean, it's not like people go running to do this. We have to model and train them in it. So yes, they might do it like, oh, I'll do reading. Let me tell you, I never get through, I would say, by the end of 2 sessions of training, 90% of my students are completely engaged already. And what's the difference? Well, because I bring them a variety of books online or in person. I tell them to go choose something, but I've already given them a pretest. So I've already suggested, okay, you need to read books from this pile. You need to read books from this pile. That's where you're going to start. They look through, they find something they think is interesting. They sit down and start reading. And guess what? They're successful. Well, there's nothing like success. And you know, the human brain is happy when it's learning. The human brain is happy when it's learning or getting messages that are meaningful. So I would say the motivation comes internally. I'm not saying that they're going to love it. It's going to be their first favorite thing. So I require it. But I would tell you in class, I can tell so quickly 90% of my students are engaged in the reading in the moment. And then, of course, I require them to do it. They didn't become independent. I'm going to go now buy my own books and start reading. But I have students every semester who go way beyond what I ask them to, many who do just as much as I ask them to. And then I have students who, you know, email me a semester later and say, hey, you know, I really want my sister to start doing this because it's so good, you know, but I can see them in the classroom engaging. You can tell when you're looking at someone whether they're really reading and enjoying it or not. So motivation, that's an obstacle we are putting in front of them and us because we've never tried to get them things that that are easy enough for them to read successfully.
Perfect. I don't think, you know, anyone else could answer it better than you. So yeah, we have another question by Tasneem Shahnaz from New Delhi, India, and she asked, when there's a prescribed syllabus, is it difficult to implement extensive reading?
No, what I do is basically, you know, there are things, again, if you value it, you will find that, you know, we could spend maybe 10 minutes less, you know, twice a week on something else in the class and use that for training. Now, I don't want students to do extensive reading for 10 minutes. I want students to read for a minimum of 30 minutes at a time. Okay, less than 20, 30 minutes, they don't actually get into, you might say, you know, the rhythm of reading. So eventually, you know, it might be that we cancel something, we do 30 minutes of reading in the class. But again, for me, in my semester, within 2 weeks, my students are doing all of their extensive reading out of class. Oh, maybe one time in the middle, I'll say, hey, everybody bring a book to class. We're going to read in class today. It's like a party. Okay, so, but we're not taking a lot of time away from everything else. In fact, I spend much more time than I used to in class doing many of those fluency development training activities, speed reading, paced reading, word recognition, you know, rapid word recognition activity. And those are very short time, like 5 minutes here, 5 minutes here, 5 minutes here. We're still doing things in the textbook. So I don't believe that there's no time, because I think if you value it, you can see, you know, I might not need to spend this many minutes on talking about X vocabulary because I know my students are going to get so much vocabulary by doing all this reading.
Great. So Dr. Susiana from Indonesia asked that if you could share some of the resources which can be used in extensive reading. I think Dr. Thomas Robb did a wonderful webinar last year on all these resources and materials.
Well, again, I would start with the Extensive Reading Foundation, and there are so many suggestions there for how you can do reading materials. And yeah, I mean, in most situations, if you can get a colleague, you know, and work together so that, you know, you're generating, you know, collecting materials and sharing them, it's a great way. But for English, there is just a lot available.
Okay, so Gloria from Philippines, she asked that do we consider that the major factor why learners cannot comprehend of what they are reading in extensive reading?
Well, then they're not reading the right thing. I mean, if they can't comprehend, then they have chosen something outside of their linguistic competence. So then they have to have things that are easier. And like I said, you cannot overestimate how easy they need to be. So one of the things is that before you implement such a program, it's important that you read a lot of, you know, you read the material. and you can see the differences, and so that you'll be able, if you see someone struggling, you know, and sort of pretending to read, or, you know, showing all these impatient behaviors reading, right, when you're training them, then you have to find things that are easier for them to read, and teach them the 5-finger rule. So it's trying to eliminate the problem of comprehension. If we eliminate the problem of comprehension, we actually are allowing the students to get more language into their brains. Their brains are teaching them the language. We facilitate that in the classroom, and all we can do in the classroom is help it maybe to be a little bit faster, because we're facilitating it. But the reality is the brain is doing the work, and it just needs the language data in there to make sense of it. And you know that, yes, it's a little different for adults than for children, but surprisingly not as different as we once thought.
Yeah. And there's another question by the same. He asked that how useful is extensive reading for beginners?
Extensive reading, I didn't hear the last part. Extensive reading
For beginners.
Well, put it this way: if you don't know any words, you can't read, right? so you have to have some vocabulary. Now, if they are reading in their own language, then they already know what reading is. So then you know, I have seen materials for almost near beginners. And again, how important it is that there is control on vocabulary, and that it's very familiar type of content. So that obviously they're doing some guessing. So no, absolute beginners, like 0. And if they don't know how to read in their own language, they can't do this. Now, some of the very first studies of ER were done back in the like 70s, 80s in Indonesia. And they were actually done with children in school. And it was like called book flood at that time. And there were remarkable gains that children got over time. So again, you from the research and the theory, we know the implicit learning is happening, and that the knowledge is growing and will last a long time. But you won't see it immediately, you know, in a test score. But once you start reading in the, you know, 500,000, 1 million range, then actually there's evidence that you're going to see TOEIC or TOEFL scores start to change. That's just by implicit. So of course, the explicit work that you do, the intensive work that you do, that's combining with this. So, I mean, that's all adding up together, right? So you can start with fairly low and in English. Now, in terms of free materials, I don't know. I don't know, but I know that there are available graded readers for very young learners and beginners. Yeah, adult beginners and children. Mm-hmm.
So there's another question by Rasha, and he asked, and what if they want to read, but they cannot choose or decide the right book to read? And do you recommend authentic materials for, you know, ER? And yeah.
No, I recommend authentic reading behavior. So what is authentic? Like what's your definition of authentic? If what you mean by authentic, it was written by a native speaker for native speakers. No, like who, like in a language that you're learning, are you able to read that material without a dictionary? You know, without a grammar book beside you? I mean, no. So that's language study. That's 25% of your curriculum. Fine, do it. But that's not extensive reading. That's not meaningful input. That's just arduous, hard-working grammar, vocabulary work. So no, but there are, you know, materials that have been written for language learning adults. That's authentic material because it was written for that audience, right? Where there's been some control on vocabulary, there's been some control on complexity, grammatical complexity. There's some control on, for example, people have also studied aspects of learner literature. You know, if there are too many characters, hard to follow. If there are too many changes in time in the story, hard to follow. So we know there are types of materials that are just easier to read to make them comprehensible. But absolutely, it has to be in their linguistic comfort zone.
I don't know if I'm pronouncing this name rightly, Wilmrugan, and he asked that any specific strategies for the students to overcome reading hindrances.
I'm not sure if I heard it all clearly. Sorry. Could you ask me again?
Strategies for any specific strategies for students to overcome reading hindrances?
Well, I do spend time and have them reflect on, you know, their own reading, like what they read, what they like to read or do or don't read in their own language. So we do some reflection on just reading as a practice. Some students have never thought that, like, again, like take the book and go to a cafe. Or I realize with COVID that's a little tricky, but I mean, they really, you know, they just don't think of doing English as something normal. It's just that, you know, that painful classroom activity. And so sometimes it's just, you know, like, do you have a good light? You know, are you in a comfortable chair? I mean, so those are the kinds of things. But honestly, I haven't seen that as a problem. Now, if students are able, you know, if they have some resources and are able, for example, to get something like X Reading, which is a paid for subscription, well, then they've got the stories with them everywhere they go on their phones and tablets. And then, you know, there's never an excuse. I mean, it's with you all the time. You're looking at your screen anyway, so why not read? I honestly don't find, when I implement this, that there are as many hindrances as I think there might be before starting. And it all hinges on the students are understanding the books. They actually find it as an easy way to learn English. Mind you, I'm telling them, you know, this is what the research says, you know, this is, you know, and I take it very seriously. So this is not like fool around time. Like, you are doing serious work for your language development.
A lot of questions around motivation and developing interest. So one of the examples I remember from my undergraduate days, and so, you know, students are motivated when they get rewarded. So one of the things our professor did, that we had to read this whole book and write a review for it, and we were actually graded 10 points for that. So I think it could work also.
Well, I mean, I fully believe in writing reviews. I don't put a lot of grading on that, because then it turns the reading into a writing activity. And I really want to honor the reading. But I really like the idea of having book chats where it's like a book club where the students bring reviews of the books that they've read and you know, say, okay, I've read all these books. This is the one I'd like to recommend, you know, to other students. This is why I like it. And I give them some guidelines for that. I have had students, you know, draw up sort of picture posters of the books that they like, and we have a fair and everybody looks at the books. So I think there's all kinds of ways to, you know, to engage them in more than just the reading to help motivate them. But I never want that to end up taking more of their time than the reading itself. I see that some people are asking for the,
so
will they be able to get the PowerPoint from you?
Well, I can share it if you permit in the development webinars group, and they can, you know, easily access from there.
That's fine. Sure.
Yes, I'll make it PDF and then share in the Facebook group.
Excellent.
Great. So
I mean,
yeah,
I probably made a few changes, so I'll send you the most recent draft by email, and then
sure,
I'll send you a PDF, and you can put it into the group.
that would be great.
Yeah.
So lots of appreciation for your session, and we were truly delighted to have your teacher development webinar, Dr. Doreen Ewert, and we appreciate it's too late for you, but then that's a dedication to share your knowledge and expertise. Thanks very much for contributing to this cause of teacher development webinars. We are truly delighted. If you are any final words for our audience?
I'm just delighted that I could be a part of this group. It just gets me all excited to see all the places that you're all from, and wish I could travel to meet you all. But hopefully you can all get those students reading and learning language.
Thanks very much. So if you're interested in rewatching or sharing this session, and this recording will be available at Teacher Development Webinars YouTube channel, so you can share with your colleagues. And we are available on our social media, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook. So Dr. Tom would say everywhere. So yeah, you can follow us for our future webinars. Thanks very much. We appreciate that. If you require a certificate for this session, and so there's actually 300 Pakistani rupees for certificate on demand, or if you are from abroad, it requires you some $5. But we have very few requests for these certificates. So yeah, the webinar is completely free, and we appreciate your attendance today. Thanks very much. See you next time.